The snowstorm raged across the empty road, a bitter wind howling through the barren trees. But in the midst of the blinding white, Rachel saw something that made her heart stop. A dog, tied to a tree, barely clinging to life. His fur was matted with ice, his body too weak to fight the cold any longer. Who would do such a cruel thing? And why? But as Rachel freed the trembling German shepherd, she had no idea that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than she ever imagined. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment and be part of this journey with us. May this story bring warmth to your heart. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Storm and the Abandoned Dog. The wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping through the skeletal trees lining the desolate road. Snowflakes lashed against the windshield, thickening by the second, turning the world into an endless white void. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. The old Jeep groaned under the weight of the storm, its headlights barely cutting through the swirling blizzard. Tonight, she was returning home from visiting Linda, an old friend from the clinic. The storm had arrived faster than expected, and now she regretted staying so late. Her cabin was still 20 miles away, nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where solitude and the quiet hum of nature had become her only companions. She preferred it that way. People were complicated. Animals, at least, were honest. Just as she reached for the radio dial, something in the snow caught her eye, a dark shape, motionless against the stark white. At first, she thought it was just a fallen branch, half buried in the drift, but as she drove closer, her stomach clenched. It wasn't a branch. It was a dog. Rachel slammed the brakes, the Jeep skidding slightly before stopping. She sat frozen for a moment, her breath misting the cold air inside the car. The storm howled around her, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The dog was tied to a tree. Rachel didn't hesitate. She pushed open the door, the wind nearly ripping it from her grasp. Snow crunched under her boots as she hurried toward the animal, her coat flaring behind her. The closer she got, the worse the sight became. It was a German shepherd, but barely recognizable as one. His fur was matted with mud and ice, his ribs jutting out beneath his thin coat. His ears drooped, though they twitched slightly at her approach. He was lying on his side, his breath shallow, fogging in the frigid air. A thick rope was wound tightly around his neck, tethering him cruelly to the tree. Snow had piled around his body, half burying his legs, as if the storm itself had begun claiming him. Rachel knelt beside him, her gloved hands already fumbling for the Swiss Army knife she always carried. "Hey there, boy," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You're all right now. I'm going to get you out of here." The dog's eyes flickered open, deep brown, filled with exhaustion and fear. He didn't move, didn't growl. It was as if he had accepted his fate, as if he had long since stopped fighting. Rachel's throat tightened. Someone had left him here to die. With practiced efficiency, she cut through the rope, wincing at the raw, chafed skin beneath it. The dog flinched, but didn't resist. She hesitated only a moment before slipping her arms under his frail body. He was lighter than he should have been, dangerously underweight for a breed built for strength and endurance. As she struggled to her feet, the storm clawed at her, biting through her coat, but she barely felt it. Her only focus was getting this poor creature to safety. She staggered back to the Jeep, wrenching open the passenger door and easing the dog onto the worn leather seat. He barely stirred as she wrapped a spare blanket around him, tucking it snugly around his trembling frame. Rachel climbed back behind the wheel, slamming the door against the wind. Her fingers burned as she turned the key, relief washing over her as the engine roared back to life. She glanced at the dog. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow but steady. He was still alive, but he wouldn't be for long if she didn't get him warmed up. "Hold on, boy," she said softly, pulling back onto the road. "You're not dying tonight." The Jeep plowed forward, its tires crunching over ice. Rachel pressed the gas a little harder, already running through the list of things she needed to do when they got home. Warm fluids, a soft bed, food in small amounts to avoid shocking his system. As the cabin's warm glow finally appeared through the storm, Rachel exhaled in relief. The storm may have raged outside, but inside, this dog would be safe. The soft crackling of the fireplace filled the cabin with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the raging storm outside. Snow battered against the windows, a relentless force of nature. But inside, the world was quiet, save for the rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's shallow breaths. He lay curled in the thick blankets Rachel had wrapped around him, his large body trembling slightly despite the warmth seeping into his bones. Rachel sat on the floor beside him, her back resting against the old wooden couch. Her fingers idly ran over his fur, now only slightly damp after she had dried him with a thick towel. The matted, filthy coat was a dull mix of black and tan, its natural luster hidden beneath layers of grime. She could feel the sharp ridges of his ribs beneath her fingertips, a stark reminder of how close to starvation he had been. She had seen cases like this before: neglect, malnourishment, dogs abandoned by people who saw them as disposable. But this was different. The deep scars hidden beneath his fur told a story far more brutal. Some wounds had healed into thin, raised lines, others were rough patches of skin, where fur had failed to grow back completely. Someone had done this to him. Someone had deliberately caused him pain. Rachel sighed, pushing herself up and moving to the kitchen. The cabin wasn't large, but it was cozy, filled with relics of a life spent surrounded by animals. Old veterinary books lined the shelves, next to framed photos of her late husband David and the dogs they had rescued over the years. The walls bore scratches from excited paws, remnants of the many creatures she had taken in, loved, and eventually let go. But now, there was only silence. Until tonight. She filled a small bowl with warm water, stirring in a pinch of electrolytes to help rehydrate the dog. He was too weak for food just yet, but he needed something to stabilize him. Returning to his side, she gently nudged the bowl toward him. "Come on, buddy. Just a little sip." The dog's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't lift his head. Instead, he only shifted slightly, his deep brown eyes barely opening. Rachel could see the exhaustion in them, the way they seemed to hold something broken, something long lost. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You need a name," she murmured, studying his face. The strong structure of his skull, the way his ears, though drooped with fatigue, still carried the regal bearing of his breed. He was a fighter, a survivor. "Zeus," she decided softly. "That's what I'll call you." At the sound of the name, the dog's eyes flickered, as if something deep within him stirred. He didn't react beyond that, but Rachel took it as a good sign. Names had power. Maybe this one would help him find the strength to hold on. The night passed slowly. Rachel stayed by Zeus's side, dozing off in the armchair nearby. Every so often, she would wake to check on him, ensuring his breathing remained steady. Outside, the storm began to wane, the howling winds dying down to a dull whisper. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that something shifted. A noise, a faint whimper, barely audible, broke through the quiet. Rachel blinked awake, her muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair. She turned toward Zeus, who had begun to stir. His paws twitched, his breathing quickened, and then suddenly, a strangled whine escaped his throat. His body jerked slightly, as if caught in a nightmare, his legs moving as if he were running. Rachel moved quickly, kneeling beside him. "Zeus," she called gently, placing a hand on his side. "You're safe." But the moment her fingers touched him, he snapped awake with a violent start. A deep guttural growl tore from his throat as he scrambled backward, his body pressing against the wall, his ears pinned flat, eyes wide with terror. His entire body trembled, every muscle taut with fear. Rachel froze, keeping her hands visible and her posture relaxed. "It's okay," she said softly, but she could see that he wasn't hearing her. His mind was elsewhere, locked in whatever horrors had conditioned him to react this way. Then, something shifted again. The fear in his eyes wavered, recognition replacing blind panic. His breathing slowed, and his growl faded into a low whimper. His tail, previously stiff as a board, dropped slightly. Rachel didn't move. She simply waited, allowing him to decide what happened next. After a long moment, Zeus lowered his head, his ears still half flattened, but no longer in aggression. Rachel exhaled slowly, her heart still pounding. This wasn't just the fear of an abandoned dog. This was trauma, deep-seated, ingrained into his very being. She finally stood, moving to the kitchen to give him space. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind raced with questions. What had been done to him? Who had left him in the storm? And why? She turned back toward Zeus, who had settled once more but remained tense, his body curled tightly as if preparing for something unseen. Whatever had happened to him, she was going to find out. Morning sunlight spilled through the cabin's small windows, casting long golden streaks over the wooden floors. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air inside was crisp with the lingering bite of the fading storm. Rachel stood by the counter, cradling a steaming mug of coffee between her hands, her gaze fixed on Zeus, who lay curled up on the thick dog bed she had placed near the hearth. His breathing was slow, steady, but there was a weight in the way he lay. His body tight, his ears still flicking at the faintest noise. She had been around dogs long enough to recognize deep-seated trauma when she saw it. Zeus was exhausted, but he wasn't at peace. Even in sleep, he was bracing himself for something. Rachel exhaled, setting down her mug. The questions that had plagued her since last night remained unanswered. Who had left him out there? What had been done to him? She needed to know, not just for her own curiosity, but to ensure that whoever had hurt him wouldn't hurt another animal again. There was only one way to start. Take Zeus to the vet for a full medical evaluation. Zeus wasn't keen on leaving the warmth of the cabin, but after some coaxing, using bits of chicken she had left over from dinner, he hesitantly stepped into the old Jeep. His movements were stiff, his eyes darting with suspicion at the unfamiliar surroundings. He didn't protest, but his body remained tense the entire drive, every turn in the road making his ears twitch. Rachel pulled into the gravel lot of Dr. Miller's veterinary clinic, a modest, single-story brick building with a faded blue sign that had seen too many Colorado winters. The clinic had been a cornerstone of the town for decades, run by Thomas Miller, a vet in his late 60s with a thick head of gray hair and a permanently furrowed brow. He was a man who had seen it all: farm accidents, abused animals, and heartwarming rescues. Rachel had known him for years, and though he was gruff in demeanor, his heart had always been in the right place. As she opened the Jeep's door, Zeus hesitated, his ears flattened slightly, his paws gripping the floor of the vehicle as if expecting something bad to happen. Rachel didn't pull or force him. Instead, she crouched beside him, her voice steady. "You're safe," she murmured, offering her hand. It took a moment, but Zeus finally took a tentative step down, his large frame moving cautiously beside her. Inside the clinic, the scent of antiseptic and fresh hay from the small livestock pens out back filled the air. A young receptionist, Megan, greeted Rachel with a bright but tired smile. She was in her mid-20s with auburn hair tied up in a messy bun, freckles scattering across her pale skin. "Rachel, haven't seen you in a while," she said, eyeing Zeus curiously. "Who's this big guy?" Rachel gave a small, weary smile. "I found him in the storm last night, tied to a tree. He needs a full checkup." Megan's expression darkened. She had worked in the clinic long enough to know what that meant. "Dr. Miller's finishing up with a horse out back, but I'll let him know you're here." Rachel led Zeus into the exam room, giving him time to sniff the space before sitting beside him on the floor. She could see his unease, his tail low, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting to every corner of the room. What had this dog been through to make him so afraid of enclosed spaces? A few minutes later, Dr. Miller entered, wiping his hands on a rag. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his face as lined as an old leather saddle, but his sharp gray eyes softened slightly at the sight of Rachel. "You're supposed to be retired," he grumbled, though there was no malice in his tone. Rachel huffed a small laugh. "I tried. Retirement's boring." She gestured to Zeus. "He's the reason I'm here today." Miller crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there, big fella," he murmured, his voice gentle despite his usual gruffness. Zeus stiffened, but didn't recoil. Miller didn't force contact, letting Zeus take the first move. After a moment, the dog sniffed the air cautiously, his muscles still coiled, but no longer trembling. The exam was thorough. Miller checked Zeus's teeth, ears, paws, and ran his hands gently over his rib cage, shaking his head at the obvious signs of malnourishment. "He's been underfed for a long time," he muttered. "Muscle loss. Likely dehydrated when you found him, but the scars—" He turned Zeus slightly, examining the healed-over wounds along his back and legs. "Some of these are from fights. Others, I'd bet my license someone did this to him." Rachel's stomach clenched. She had known, but hearing it confirmed made her anger simmer beneath the surface. "He's got no tags," she said, "but I was hoping you could scan for a chip." Miller nodded, grabbing the handheld scanner. He ran it along Zeus's neck and shoulders, the small device beeping as it detected something. Rachel leaned forward as Miller checked the screen. Then he frowned. "What?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp. Miller sighed. "The chip's here, but it's been wiped. No owner info, no address. Just a number that doesn't match any registered database." Rachel's pulse quickened. Someone had erased Zeus's identity. "Can you tell where the chip was originally registered?" Miller scratched his beard. "Megan, pull up the old database backups. Sometimes the system keeps traces of deleted records." Megan worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. A few minutes later, she let out a small, "Aha! Got something." The original owner was listed as Kyle Dawson. The name meant nothing to Rachel. She frowned. "Does that name sound familiar to you?" Miller's expression darkened slightly. "It does, but not for good reasons." Rachel's grip tightened on Zeus's leash. "Tell me everything." Miller exhaled, leaning against the counter. Dawson used to live in a ranch outside of town near the forest line. No one saw much of him, but rumor had it he was into some shady dealings. Then, about a year ago, poof, vanished. The place was abandoned overnight. Rachel's mind whirred. "You think Zeus belonged to him?" Miller crossed his arms. "I think Dawson had a lot of dogs, and not for good reasons." Rachel felt her stomach twist. Zeus had reacted violently to enclosed spaces, to loud noises, to men approaching too quickly. The scars, the chipped-out records, the fear buried in his bones. It all pointed to something terrible. She turned to Megan. "Does Dawson have any next of kin, family, friends?" Megan shook her head. "None listed." Then, after a pause, "But his old neighbor, Frank Howell, might know something." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Where can I find him?" Megan scribbled an address on a sticky note. "He runs a small feed store near Main Street. If anyone around here remembers Dawson, it's him." Rachel took the note, her jaw set. She looked down at Zeus, who was watching her with quiet, solemn eyes. "Who are you?" she wondered. "And what did he do to you?" She was going to find out. The drive to the abandoned ranch was long and desolate. Rachel navigated her old Jeep down a winding dirt road, the tires crunching over patches of snow that had yet to melt under the weak winter sun. The farther she drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Trees stood tall and bare on either side of the road, their skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky like twisted fingers. There were no houses, no signs of life, just miles of cold, empty land stretching into the distance. Zeus sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed ahead, as if he recognized where they were going. His ears twitched at every bump in the road, but he remained eerily quiet. Rachel glanced at him, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much he had endured. He was too still, too silent, as if he had spent years learning not to draw attention to himself. The ranch came into view, and Rachel's stomach twisted. The place was falling apart. The main house, a large weathered building with peeling white paint, stood lifeless, its windows boarded up. The surrounding land was overgrown, tall weeds and dead grass creeping up along a rusted wire fence that sagged in places where the posts had rotted. A faded wooden sign, barely legible, hung crookedly near the entrance. Dawson Ranch. Rachel pulled the Jeep to a stop near the entrance, stepping out cautiously. The air was colder here, as if the land itself had held on to the memory of the cruelty that once took place. Zeus hesitated before jumping down from the Jeep, his paws crunching on the frozen ground. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his body tense, his tail low. Rachel scanned the property. The place was abandoned, but it didn't feel empty. She had spent years working in animal rescue, walking into neglected barns, hoarder homes, and fighting pits that reeked of suffering. This place had the same feel, the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. She walked toward the barn first, its red paint faded to a dull rust. The doors hung slightly ajar, swaying faintly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Rows of rusted cages lined the walls, some still containing chewed-up collars and broken chains. Scratches marred the wooden planks, deep gouges where desperate paws had clawed at their prison. Zeus let out a low whimper behind her. Rachel crouched, running her fingers over the scratches. She didn't need to imagine what had happened here. She knew. Dogs had been held here, forced into fights they never wanted, trained through pain and starvation until they either obeyed or died. Near the center of the barn, she found a heavy wooden trapdoor, partially covered by an old mildewed tarp. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing hold of the rusted handle and pulling it open. A sharp creak echoed through the barn as the door lifted, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. Rachel pulled a small flashlight from her coat pocket, the beam cutting through the dust-choked air. The basement was cold and damp, the concrete walls cracked with age. The room was empty save for a few scattered metal bowls and old training equipment, shock collars, muzzles, leashes with heavy chains, and in the far corner, barely visible beneath a pile of discarded wooden planks, was a ledger book. Rachel crossed the room carefully, her boots scuffing against the gritty floor. She knelt, brushing away layers of dust before prying the book open. The pages were yellowed, filled with lists of names and numbers, dates scrawled in harsh, impatient handwriting. Dogs. Each entry detailed a different dog, breed, weight, temperament. Next to many of the names were brutal notes: aggressive, good fighter, weak, disposed of, training failure. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep reading. Then she found it. Zeus. His name stood out on the page, marked with a thick, jagged line through it. Next to it, the notes were different from the others. Refuses to fight, too soft, liability, removal ordered. Rachel's grip on the book tightened. They had abandoned him because he wouldn't fight, because he had refused to become what they wanted him to be. They had seen him as defective, a failure, and so they had left him tied to that tree in the middle of a blizzard to die alone. Her stomach churned with rage. Zeus had never been a failure. He had been brave enough to resist, to refuse to be turned into a weapon, and for that, he had nearly paid with his life. Rachel exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against her forehead. She had expected to find something terrible here, but seeing it in black and white, seeing the cold indifference with which they had discarded him, it made her sick. A sudden noise broke the silence. Rachel froze, a faint creak coming from above her. Someone was inside the barn. Her heart pounded as she quickly shut the ledger, tucking it into her coat. She turned off the flashlight, letting the shadows swallow her. Zeus, as if sensing the shift, pressed himself close to her, his body rigid. Another noise, a footstep, slow and deliberate. Rachel held her breath, straining to listen. Whoever it was, they weren't moving quickly. They were either searching for something, or they knew she was here and wanted her to know it too. Carefully, she moved toward the stairs, keeping her steps light. She reached the trapdoor and peered through the opening. A figure stood just inside the barn, their back partially turned, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket and heavy boots. The way they moved was cautious, their head tilting slightly, as if listening. Rachel's pulse hammered. Who were they? And why were they here? She felt Zeus shift beside her. His ears were flat, his muscles coiled, but he didn't make a sound. She had two choices: stay hidden and hope they left, or confront them head-on. She chose the latter. Taking a deep breath, Rachel pushed open the trapdoor with a sharp creak. The noise startled the figure, who whipped around to face her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Dark, unreadable. A flicker of recognition crossed their face, and then without a word, they turned and bolted toward the exit. "Hey!" Rachel shouted, scrambling up the stairs. By the time she reached the doorway, the figure had disappeared into the trees, their heavy boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. Rachel stood there, her breath coming fast, her hands trembling slightly. Someone had been watching her. Maybe they had been watching this place for a long time. She looked down at Zeus, whose eyes remained locked on the tree line, his body tense. Something told her this wasn't over, not even close. Rachel drove away from the abandoned ranch, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered road. Zeus sat beside her in the passenger seat, his ears alert, his body still tense from their encounter back at the barn. Rachel kept glancing at the rearview mirror, an uneasy feeling settling deep in her chest. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Who had been at the ranch? And why had they run the moment they saw her? The drive back to her cabin was quiet, but the silence didn't bring her comfort. Her mind replayed the events of the day. The discovery of the ledger, Zeus's name scrawled among the list of fighting dogs, the sudden appearance of a stranger in the barn. It all pointed to something bigger, something dangerous. Zeus hadn't just been a neglected dog. He had been part of something illegal, something someone didn't want her uncovering. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the sky had darkened to a deep indigo, the first few stars flickering in the cold night. Rachel shut off the engine, exhaling slowly before turning to Zeus. "Come on, boy, let's get inside." Zeus jumped down from the Jeep, his paws sinking slightly into the snow. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his body stiff. Rachel noticed the change in his posture immediately. He was on high alert. She followed his gaze toward the road leading up to her cabin. That's when she saw it. A dark-colored sedan was parked just beyond her property line, its engine off, its windows tinted. Rachel's pulse quickened. She wasn't expecting visitors. No one ever came up here unannounced. She felt Zeus press against her leg, his muscles coiled beneath his thick coat. A low growl rumbled from his chest. A warning. Rachel didn't hesitate. She reached into the pocket of her coat, pulling out her .38 revolver, an old habit she had never abandoned since moving to the mountains alone. She had never needed it before, but tonight, the weight of it in her hand felt reassuring. For a long moment, the car remained still. Then, as if sensing her scrutiny, the engine roared to life. The tires crunched against the snow as the vehicle backed up, slowly turning around before disappearing down the road. Rachel stood there, her breath visible in the freezing air, heart pounding. Who the hell was that? Zeus remained stiff beside her, his growl fading as the car disappeared into the darkness. Rachel gave him a small pat on the side before leading him inside. She locked the door behind her, bolting it for the first time in years. The cabin felt too quiet, the usual warmth of the wooden interior failing to ease the unease crawling over her skin. She placed her revolver on the kitchen counter, her fingers lingering over the cool metal before moving toward the fireplace. The familiar motions of stacking logs and lighting the fire helped steady her nerves, but it wasn't enough to stop the nagging voice in the back of her mind. She had seen that kind of car before, tinted windows, unmarked, deliberately parked just outside her land. It was the kind of vehicle used by people who didn't want to be seen. Rachel sat heavily in her armchair, Zeus curling up near her feet. She reached down, running a hand over his head, feeling the tension still lingering in his body. He was still wary, his ears twitching at every distant sound outside. Then came the knock. Rachel froze. Not a loud knock, not urgent, just two soft taps against her front door. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. She grabbed the revolver, rising silently from the chair. Zeus's ears perked up, and his body stiffened as he turned toward the door. Rachel moved carefully, pressing her back against the wall as she glanced toward the window. The porch light cast a dim glow over the snow-covered steps, but she didn't see anyone standing there. Then she saw it. A small white envelope tucked neatly against the bottom of the door frame. Her grip tightened around the gun as she reached for the door handle. Slowly, cautiously, she pulled it open. The night was silent. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. Rachel bent down, retrieving the envelope. The paper was cold, stiff from the freezing air. She stepped back inside, closing the door before unfolding the note inside. The message was short. Only 5 words. "Stop digging. Not your business." Rachel stared at the words, anger bubbling beneath her skin. So this was a warning. Someone knew she had been at the ranch. Someone knew she had found the ledger, and they wanted her to stay out of it. But Rachel Parker had never been the kind of woman who backed down from a fight. She set the note on the table, taking a deep breath. Fear curled in the pit of her stomach, but fear had never stopped her before. She had spent years fighting for animals like Zeus, for the voiceless victims who had no one else. She wasn't about to let some anonymous threat stop her now. Zeus watched her, his deep brown eyes studying her face, as if he knew, as if he understood that this fight wasn't over yet. Rachel reached for her phone. She had a call to make. Rachel sat in her cabin, her fingers tapping lightly against the worn wooden table. The note still lay in front of her, its 5 words burning into her memory. Stop digging. Not your business. But it was her business now. Zeus lay beside her, his breathing steady, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her he knew this wasn't over. He had been a survivor for too long not to recognize the weight of danger in the air. Rachel had never been the kind of woman to walk away from a fight. especially when innocent lives were at stake. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Rachel Parker. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Rachel exhaled, leaning forward. "Hello, Mason. I need your help." Mason Carter had been a reporter for almost 20 years, a relentless investigative journalist who had once been one of the most respected names in animal cruelty investigations. He was a man in his late 40s, with broad shoulders and a presence that made people uneasy. His face was rugged, with lines carved from years of chasing stories, exposing criminals, and sometimes getting too close to danger. He had once been Rachel's closest ally, until a case went bad, and he had been forced to leave town after crossing the wrong people. Now, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. "You found something, didn't you?" Rachel didn't waste time. "A fighting ring, a big one. Zeus was part of it. I found records, dogs that were used, dogs that were killed. And now, someone is watching me." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then, Mason sighed. "Text me everything you have. I'll start digging." Rachel did just that, sending over pictures of the ledger, the location of the abandoned ranch, and the warning note she had received. It wasn't long before Mason called back. "Kyle Dawson," Mason said, his voice laced with something sharp. "You know who he is, right?" Rachel frowned. "I only know he owned Zeus and ran that ranch. What else do you have?" Mason let out a slow breath. "Dawson isn't just some backyard criminal. He used to be part of an organized fighting network, one that stretches across multiple states. These aren't just guys throwing pit bulls in cages and making bets in a basement. This is a multi-million-dollar operation, with connections to law enforcement, to politicians. It's why it's so hard to take them down." Rachel's stomach twisted. She had suspected something bigger, but this was worse than she had imagined. "If that's true, then we need to act fast," she said. "I don't want Zeus's story to end here. I want justice for him and for every dog that suffered under Dawson." Mason was silent for a moment. Then, with a determined edge to his voice, he said, "I'm coming to town. We'll blow this story wide open." The next few days passed in a blur of research, late-night phone calls, and cautious meetings. Mason arrived in Colorado, looking as worn as ever, but his sharp, calculating mind had lost none of its edge. They met at a small cafe in town where Mason laid out his plan. "We need to get the police involved, but we can't trust just anyone," he said, stirring his coffee. "This operation has too many moving parts, too many people with something to lose if it gets shut down." Rachel nodded. "So, who do we trust?" Mason pulled out his phone, showing her a name, Detective Laura Bennett. "She's out of Denver. She's been after these guys for years, but never had enough evidence to make arrests stick. If we give her what you found, plus whatever else I can dig up, she might be able to make a case strong enough to bring them down." Rachel studied the picture on the screen. Laura was in her early 40s, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to see through lies instantly. Her reputation was well known. She had spent years fighting organized crime, taking down traffickers, drug dealers, and dogfighting rings when she could. Rachel exhaled. "Let's do it." 2 nights later, Rachel and Mason sat in a dimly lit police station, watching as Detective Bennett flipped through the documents they had provided. She wore a dark blue blazer over a crisp white shirt, her auburn hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Her jaw was set, her expression unreadable as she examined the ledger, the pictures, and the reports. Finally, she looked up. "This is enough for a warrant," she said, "but I need more before we can move in on Dawson's crew." Mason leaned forward. "What if I can get proof that fights are still happening? Live fights?" Bennett raised an eyebrow. "How?" Mason smirked. "I have contacts in places you don't." Rachel wasn't sure she liked the sound of that, but before she could ask, Bennett nodded. "Get me something concrete. If we catch them in the act, we can take down the whole operation." 3 days later, it happened. The police raided an illegal fighting pit just outside of town, based on the evidence Mason had gathered. 23 dogs were found in cages, their bodies scarred, their spirits broken. Some were too injured to stand, others so terrified they cowered at the slightest noise. Kyle Dawson was arrested on site, along with 4 other men who had been running the ring. The charges stacked against them: animal cruelty, illegal gambling, conspiracy, would ensure they never walked free again. Rachel stood outside the police station that night, watching as Zeus sat beside her, his eyes locked on the flashing red and blue lights in the distance. He was finally free. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "It's over," she whispered. "No one can hurt you now." Zeus looked at her, then, slowly, for the first time since she had found him, his tail gave a single wag. Rachel smiled. "Yeah, I think we're going to be okay." Snow blanketed the mountains in a soft, untouched white, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sharp winter air carried the scent of pine and the distant crackle of a nearby fire, curling from the chimney of Rachel's cabin. Inside, the warmth was tangible, not just from the flickering flames in the fireplace, but from the quiet peace that had settled within its wooden walls. Zeus lay stretched out on a thick rug near the fire, his body relaxed in a way Rachel had never seen before. His large frame, once so frail and trembling, now carried strength. His coat, once dull and matted, had regained its deep black and tan sheen, a testament to months of care, warmth, and trust. His ears twitched at the faint sound of wind rattling against the windows, but unlike before, he didn't flinch, didn't bolt upright in panic. Rachel sat in her worn armchair, watching him. The transformation had been slow, each step forward hard-earned. The first time he had taken food from her hand without hesitation. The first time he had leaned into her touch rather than shrinking away. The first time he had wagged his tail. Just a flick, barely noticeable, but enough to fill her chest with something warm and indescribable. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. Zeus blinked up at her, then let out a small, content sigh, resting his head against her knee. Rachel smiled. "You're home, boy." Zeus had changed, but so had she. The past few months had reignited something in her, a purpose she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had convinced herself that retirement meant stepping back, that her years of fighting for animals like Zeus were behind her. But now, she knew better. That was why, earlier that week, she had driven into town and walked into Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, a modest but overburdened rescue center on the outskirts of town. The woman who ran it, Elena Martinez, was in her early 50s, a no-nonsense woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair and a voice that carried both authority and kindness. She had spent most of her life saving animals, often with limited resources and endless obstacles. Rachel had known her in passing, but had never thought much about getting involved. Until now. When Rachel stepped into the shelter, the smell of straw, disinfectant, and warm bodies greeted her. Dogs barked from behind chain-link kennels, some excited, some scared, some so broken they didn't lift their heads. Elena had looked up from a clipboard, her dark brown eyes scanning Rachel curiously. "Rachel Parker," she had said, a knowing smirk on her lips. "Didn't think I'd ever see you walk in here." Rachel had shrugged. "Guess I finally ran out of excuses." Elena had nodded, then handed her a set of kennel keys without another word. That was how it started. Rachel didn't need recognition, didn't want a title, she just wanted to help. And so, she began working at the shelter a few times a week, checking on rescues, helping with vet visits, even assisting with adoptions. It was there that Zeus had found a friend, a young German shepherd mix named Daisy, barely a year old, rescued from the same fighting ring he had escaped. Daisy was smaller, her coat a blend of gold and black, her eyes full of youthful curiosity, despite the scars on her legs. She had taken to Zeus immediately, following him with playful persistence. At first, he had been hesitant, uncertain, but over time, something in him softened. He let her nuzzle into his side, tolerated her clumsy paws batting at his ears, even allowed her to curl up beside him in the corner of the shelter's play area. Rachel had watched it all with quiet wonder. Now, as she sat in her cabin, Zeus at her side, she heard the distant rumble of an approaching car. She stood, peeking out the window to see Elena's old blue truck coming up the snow-covered path. By the time Rachel opened the door, Elena was already stepping out, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "Brought you something?" she called. Rachel arched an eyebrow as Elena walked to the passenger side and opened the door. A familiar golden-black head popped out, ears perking, tail wagging furiously. Daisy! Zeus had already stood up, his posture alert but not tense. The moment he saw Daisy, his tail gave a slow wag. Rachel frowned. "Elena!" Elena held up a hand, Before you say anything, hear me out. Daisy's been miserable at the shelter without him. She's bonded to him, Rachel. And frankly, I think he's bonded to her too. Rachel looked down at Zeus. His gaze remained fixed on Daisy, his body relaxed, his ears forward. She didn't need to ask him what he wanted. Rachel sighed, shaking her head but smiling. Guess I should have seen this coming. Elena smirked. I'd say you're getting soft in your old age. Rachel snorted. Maybe, or maybe I just don't have the energy to argue with two dogs. She stepped back, motioning inside. Come on in before you both freeze. Elena grinned, giving Daisy a light pat before the young dog bolted past her, skidding across the wooden floor in excitement. Zeus met her with a huff, but when Daisy bounced up, licking his face, he didn't pull away. Rachel just shook her head, laughing. That night, as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, Rachel sat in her chair, watching as Zeus and Daisy curled up together by the hearth. She could still remember the first night she had found Zeus, how his body had been rigid with fear, how he had trembled in his sleep. Now he slept soundly, his breathing deep and even. Rachel leaned down, brushing a gentle hand over his head, then Daisy's. From now on, she whispered, no one can ever hurt you again. We're a family. Zeus let out a soft sigh, shifting closer. Outside, the cold raged on. But inside, for the first time in a long time, everything was warm. Zeus's journey was one of resilience, healing, and the power of second chances. Once a dog abandoned in the freezing cold, left to die for refusing to become something he wasn't, he found his way to someone who saw his worth, not as a fighter, but as a soul deserving of love. His story is a testament to the idea that kindness can mend even the deepest wounds, that patience can rebuild trust, and that no creature, no matter how broken, is beyond saving. Rachel's unwavering determination to seek justice for Zeus and the countless other animals trapped in cruelty reminds us that silence is never the answer in the face of wrongdoing. It only takes one person to stand up, to fight for what is right, to bring light into the darkest corners of the world. And in doing so, she not only gave Zeus a new life, she reignited her own purpose. Perhaps there is a Zeus out there waiting for you, a soul longing for kindness, a second chance, a home. Maybe it's a dog in a shelter, a stray in need of care, or even someone in your life who has lost hope. If this story has taught us anything, it's that love, patience, and courage can change lives, both theirs and ours. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope. May God bless you and guide you always.